A brief introduction. Peter will be pleased and grateful for that as well. Some of my most embarrassing moments have been as a result of introductions. One or two of you may have heard me say before, I was once introduced by John Humphreys as delightfully offensive, which I thought coming from him was a bit rich. Worse still, he rang me a couple of weeks later to say a number of my civil service colleagues had questioned the use of the word delightful. More recently, I was introduced to an audience largely of police officers by a serving chief constable who shall remain nameless, who said, I think without intention, and now we have Michael Bichard, who of course is well known to the police. And there's not a lot to laugh about other than that at the moment, is there? It's a pretty bleak time. This isn't so much a recession, it's a financial crisis, and there is a difference. And it's unlike just about any other financial crisis we've ever faced in this country because of its severity and because of its likely longevity, which means that the traditional responses, I don't think, will suffice. As John was saying, we can't tackle this just by increasing efficiency, cutting costs and increasing productivity, or deferring desirable projects and initiatives as we perhaps have done in the past. If we do that, then I think we will end up with services which have been shown to be seriously flawed despite the huge investment of money in recent years. We will end up with those services providing increasingly unacceptable levels of support to communities, to people who are facing ever greater stresses and pressures as a result of the problems this country faces. So this is absolutely not the time, in my view, to batten down the hatches. And for many people, that is the instinctive response. I think this is the time to genuinely rethink what we do and how we do it right across the public services. It's a time to redesign our public services, including our police service. And if we do that, we could just find a way of addressing the flaws to which I have referred in our current arrangements and at the same time save the money that we need to save to cut this awful deficit. And that really has got to be our objective, as was said earlier. It's about better services at less cost. It's not just about taking out cost. But we're not going to do that by dint of grand rhetoric or political direction. It's not going to happen that way. We're only going to achieve this if we are methodical, analytical, if we actually think about the practical steps that we need to take. And I wanted to start the day really by just identifying 10. I always like to have 10. It won't take long, it won't be too painful, but 10 things that we perhaps just need to focus on. And let me say, in doing that, I know a number of these things you'll think you're doing, but I think part of this is about revisiting some of the areas and asking whether we're being imaginative enough, whether we're being radical enough. What are the 10 things? I think the first thing that we need to do is be absolutely clear about our strategy and our priorities. I mean, this is not the time to allow resources to be wasted on non-essentials. And you can only be sure about what's an essential and what's non-essential when you're crystal clear about your strategy, so that you've got some kind of framework within which to make judgments. And translating strategy into priorities, into actual decisions about what not to do, often requires a great deal of courage and a great deal of determination. When there's a lot of money about, and we may have denied it, but there has been quite a lot of money about, decisions about strategic priorities are easier because they're more often about who gets more rather than who gets none. They can be fudged, and maybe sometimes we fudge them. But this is not a time now when fudging will suffice. This is a time when we're going to have to take some serious decisions about what we stop doing or what we give a really lower priority to. So let's be absolutely clear about our strategy and our priorities. I think the second thing that we need to do, and I know government doesn't always make this easy, we need to manage for value, not for compliance. It is true, I think, that we've become obsessed in the public sector and government with targets, with indicators, with inspections, with assessments, with advice, and with guidance. Successful leaders and success have been measured too often by how well these have been complied with rather than how much value the service is added for clients, for citizens and communities. And as I say, government, of course, has been the main culprit, but local public service organisations have sometimes been equally culpable by the way in which they've managed their own staff. Too many narrow targets, too many procedural instructions, too much prescription. When resources are thin on the ground, every pound is an investment, and every pound has to add value, not just tick the bureaucratic box. So we need to be asking ourselves whether we can cut back on some of the process prescription, whether we are investing in adding value, or whether we're actually investing in compliance, maybe even after the requirement has moved on, because things are changing, and I think government accepts that they've got to change. The third thing I think we need to think really hard about is collaboration. Our governance structure in this country has become incredibly complex. I am so old, Geoffrey, that I started work for a county borough. It was known then as an all-purpose authority. And I used to do the police prosecutions as well. Great fun that was. Learning experience. We don't have all-purpose authorities of any sort anymore. We have a really complex governance system with countless organisations providing services and support to citizens, to communities. And consequently, there's very little that can be achieved by any organisation working in isolation. And resources can be used much more effectively, and investment can be maximised if there is real collaboration. And that seems just plain common sense. And yet, the public sector continues to work in silos. It makes policy in silos. It regulates and it inspects in silos. It often delivers down the same silos. And as a result, the policy often fails to address the total problem. As a result, we miss big opportunities to save money, and as a result, the clients, the public, are often confused by the way in which several different agencies, including the police, provide uncoordinated services, which of course in itself wastes huge amounts of money. If 6 or 8 different public agencies are visiting a single family, and we know that is exactly what is happening, with no real coordination taking place, it isn't surprising that we waste huge amounts of money. And there's a lot of research going on in many places around the country which is showing that to be the reality, not just the rhetoric. But more than that, even at the most basic level, issues like procurement and management of goods and materials, we're seeing money being wasted by a lack of collaboration. Do you know we spend in this country something like £220 billion a year on goods and materials across the public sector? And well over 100 billion of that is spent on services, on items that we all use, basic things like energy and paper. And yet there's no convincing purchasing strategy across the public sector. And it always seems easier to think of reasons why not to purchase jointly or share materials than it does to do it. And why is that the case? Well, again, if we're really honest with ourselves, sometimes it's about territoriality. And it's about sovereignty. It's about protecting our property and our goods. Well, I tell you, territoriality and sovereignty are luxuries we can ill afford in an age of austerity. And I think the public has the right to expect that we'll put them aside, we'll put our reluctance to collaborate aside, if it means finding ways of delivering better value for money as a result. And of course, again, it's a big national problem. I've worked in the civil service. I know how difficult it is to get departments in government to work together, and how difficult that makes it for people who are actually trying to deliver services, whatever those services are, on the ground. One hopes that the relationship between the MOJ and the Home Office, for example, will improve as a result of having Nick Herbert appointed as a Minister of State in both departments. But it needs to improve. And for me, one of the tests of the Comprehensive Spending Review on the 20th of October is whether we begin to see real signs of genuine collaboration between government departments, which will help you to work with agencies locally more effectively. Because up until now, I think we've seen some interesting examples. We've again had a lot of rhetoric, but it doesn't really add up to a significant change in the culture of government. And the last thing I'd say on collaboration is collaboration working in partnership with local partners, agencies, whether they're public or private sector, I'll come on, whether they're voluntary sector, I'll come on to that in a minute, is also about thinking really hard when you do make savings, when you do make changes, about the impact they have on your partners. If you look at what's happened in overseas countries, sometimes what we've seen is a displacement. One organisation has found a way of saving money, but it's been at the cost for another organisation. We can't allow that to happen. We've got to take a more responsible view of this right across public sector, right across local areas. And that's why I've been so involved in something called Total Place, which is about people taking responsibility for their place, not just for their organisation. And that's what I think the future has got to be more about, place and not just organisation. The fourth thing I think we need to think very carefully about is commission rather than deliver. The history of the public sector in the UK is about delivery. It's about delivering support to people and communities who need it, safe in the knowledge, so the story goes, that the public sector alone could guarantee quality, fairness and access. And as a result, we've developed armies of people who deliver. I used to run one, the benefits agency, 70,000 people working for the benefits agency. Pretty well the same now working for the employment agency, job seekers agency. And sometimes our focus, I think, has been on managing the inputs, therefore, rather than achieving the necessary outcomes. I think what we now need to do is to focus much more on the outcomes, worry less about who does the providing. We need to become better at commissioning outcomes, more willing to countenance others providing services for the public good that maybe traditionally public services have provided. We need to ask ourselves what we alone can provide so that we make the best use of our professional expertise. In all honesty, commissioning skills are in short supply, I think the way in which we go about commissioning can often limit the extent to which new potential providers are able to enter the market. I think we have extreme bureaucracy in the procurement process and a determination to specify in far too much detail how the outcome is to be achieved. But we do need to be prepared to change the culture of the public services and think more about commissioning and less about just delivery. We need to be prepared also to look at how we redesign services rather than structures. Peter and I were talking as we were sitting there earlier about how the public sector is obsessed with structures. I'm sorry, Tony, you never understood structures, and what you were saying last week shows that you still don't understand structures. If a huge increase in investment fails to deliver the expected results, which is actually the reality of 1997 to 2010, most private sector organisations would start looking at their business model. The English public sector doesn't do that, it actually reorganises its structures. We must by now have exhausted every possible structure for health, for education and local government, or maybe not. And this obsession with structure is evident in every organisation in the public sector that I've observed. And the fact is, it very rarely delivers. You don't get improvements, you don't save money by just playing around with the structures. So this is not the time for restructuring as the primary response. Sometimes it's necessary, but not as the primary response. And what we need to be doing is thinking about how our services are designed. I also, at the moment, I'm chairman of the Design Council. I get many opportunities to see great designers at first hand. And my word, we have some great designers in this country. And what they do is to design products or services around the client, around the customer. They start there. They make sure they work, that they're functional, that they're accessible, they're simple, they're affordable. And yes, that they look good, because otherwise people won't buy them. Just contrast that to the way in which we implement policies, ideas and initiatives, often with no real attention being paid to how they're designed. And let me tell you, poorly designed services, and we have a huge number of poorly designed services right across the sector, never work. However much money you pour into them, whatever structure you surround them with, they won't work and they'll waste buckets of resources. Why have you all got iPods? Why have you all got iPhones? Because they're built around the way you think, the way you operate. That's what Jonathan Ive was trying to do when he designed it. That's what we've got to start thinking around our services. How do we build them around clients? How do we make them accessible and affordable? How do we realise the potential of IT? Got to say that in this place, but it's pretty damn important. I don't think of any way in which we're going to deliver better service at less cost unless we get better at the way in which we use IT. Countless reports from the Audit Commission, the NAO, all of which accept Peter and his organisation from any blame, but countless reports on why the public sector have not been more successful in the use of IT. I don't think it's rocket science. I think there's some pretty simple requirements. I think we need to be better at making sure IT is driven by the business strategy and supports the design of the business, and that we perhaps have less of the IT trying to drive the business. It means involving the people who will deliver their technology in its design. I found in the benefits agency, I inherited an organisation where no one on the front line had been involved in designing the technology at all. And they were looking at this and saying, well, you know, so what? It doesn't actually solve any of the problems that we think exist, not even sure how we use it. It involves being realistic about what technology can deliver, not allowing design creep so that realistic projects become so sophisticated you can't deliver them. Of course, managing IT projects effectively and using people who understand the potential of IT for your business at the outset. There are fantastic examples of transformational IT in the British public sector, but they're not consistent, they're not uniform, and they need to be if we're going to tackle the current challenges. David Aubrey this afternoon is going to talk to you about how you enhance innovation. It's really important. Too easy to kind of think it's just waffle. Faced with a crisis, many people, as I've said, instinctively look to defend what they have, to protect the status quo. They don't see it as a time to try new things, especially when money's short. But if you accept that kind of thinking, we're not going to get through this crisis because doing the same old things in the same old way is going to produce roughly the same old results. This is the time when we just have to innovate. And the problem with a lot of people, in the police service I'm sure, but in public sector generally, is that they don't think they can do much to enhance the innovation of their organisation. I mean, you've either got creative people, innovative people, or you haven't. You're all leaders in this audience, actually, every one of you. And you can make a huge difference at whether or not your team, your people, actually innovate. Your personal behaviour makes a big difference. When someone brings you a new idea, what's the reaction? Well, we tried that in 1948 and it didn't work very well. It's been a bad day, there's not much money around. And people go away and they won't bother you again with a new idea. They won't bother thinking about how to deliver this service better. Eliminating narrow process targets. Rewarding the successful innovators. And one of the ways you reward people is promote them. And one of the ways the civil service made sure that people who innovated didn't stay too long, because they were sometimes difficult, was you didn't promote them. How do we manage risk? We can manage risk more effectively. It's become very paper-based and routine. We can get rid of needless paper and meetings, overlong meetings that get in the way of energy and innovation. And we can involve the front line, I am convinced, much better than we do. And most of the ideas for saving money, for better service, are on the front line, whether we're talking about clients or staff, and very often staff. Three last things. One of the things that Total Place taught us, I think, which you can say we knew, but it really came through strongly, was that we don't invest enough in prevention. And often because we don't invest enough in prevention, we build up huge costs later because we have to respond to problems that we perhaps could have stopped before they became problems. And why don't we do that? Well, sometimes I think it's because the agency which has to make the investment doesn't reap the subsequent financial benefit and therefore thinks, well, why should we invest in this prevention? It's not going to actually help us a great deal. That's an issue which this government needs to tackle. The last government began to look at it and started talking about things like social impact bonds, but it is something which needs to be taken seriously. But it's not just at a governmental level that we need to take prevention seriously. Of course, it's within individual organisations. A sensible investment in prevention can save a lot of money. And of course the police service knows that. That's why crime prevention has long been a priority. But I guess we ought to be asking ourselves at the moment, are we being imaginative enough? Is there enough effort, for example, in going into designing out crime? When I was at the university, we were doing some really quite interesting stuff, which at last the Home Office has begun to take an interest in how you can design crime out of your community, out of your society. I mean, little things like, designing chairs in pubs where women can put their handbags and sit on them. Would probably have saved the life of the woman who was murdered at Euston a few years ago. It's been very hard going. People want to talk about community and neighbourhood watch. They're not very interested in designing out crime. As I say, Home Office are beginning to take an interest in it. I've never really felt the police fully understood the potential of this. We cannot afford, literally cannot afford, the cost of waiting for social problems to hit us and reacting by providing public services in the traditional way. We need to develop a much stronger culture of prevention, and that needs to spread right across public service boundaries, not just be within one organisation. We need to work, and you'll maybe say, well, why, and we're already doing it. I think we do need to work much better in partnership with the civil society. I'm not sure what you call the third sector, the voluntary sector, or it's now the civil society, so let's call it that. The rhetoric, of course, has long been positive, working with communities, working with these sectors. But I've often questioned how genuine it was. I've chaired voluntary sector organisations. I chaired the compact between the government and the voluntary sector. I don't talk without some experience of this. But the fact is that I've often felt that the third sector, the civil society, was the public sector's equivalent of corporate social responsibility. Something you ought to do, but it didn't really make that much of a difference. And as a result, I don't think the third sector has been actively enough involved in policy development and has too often been seen as just a cheap way of delivering services. Therefore, I do think the big society is an attempt to revisit that relationship, and therefore I think the big society is something which shouldn't just be dismissed out of hand. I think the public sector, including the police, need to accept that the civil society really is part of the solution to our problems at the moment. And if it is involved effectively and genuinely, it can improve outcomes and it can save money. And my last point, and it really is a lead-in to Peter, who's about to spend 3 or 4 months looking at leadership in the police service. My last point is we need at this time a real focus on leadership and what we mean by leadership in the police service and across the public sector. Frankly, I talk to a lot of leaders in the public sector at the moment. Some of them are just in shock. They're in shock. They've never experienced a crisis of this scale. They're fearful for the future. And frankly, some of them give the impression that this is a challenge too far. And if that's what staff see, then how can we expect the staff to be approaching and addressing these problems in a positive frame of mind? I think the way in which leaders behave and the kind of leaders that we have at the moment in every public service is really, really important. We need leaders who are confident but not arrogant. We need leaders who are optimistic but not unrealistic, because people won't believe them. And we need leaders who believe that these challenges really can be overcome and communicate that every day of the week. And most of all, we need leaders who are prepared to roll up their sleeves and be part of finding the answer with staff, rather than sitting back and just watching what happens. Leadership, I think, Peter, is really the key that will unlock so many other things I've talked about this morning. Over to you.